A year of pain, but a year of invincibility. Zelensky rallies his country on the anniversary of the Russian invasion. In Kyiv, a drumbeat for every life lost, a time to comfort and remember, but to recognise too courage in the face of onslaught.
It's been a year of endurance, a year of compassion, a year of courage, a year of pain.
In Downing Street and across the UK, a minute's silence and a show of solidarity. After 12 months which have sent shockwaves through so many lives, we'll speak to Emma in Kharkiv and James in Kyiv and assess how the world navigates the challenges to come. They might be dancing on the Chinese border with Russia, but exactly how will Xi chart the months ahead with his neighbour? Debbie's there.
Relations between the two neighbours haven't always been as apparently rock solid as they are today. But Moscow's pivot to the east has given Beijing the upper hand in their limitless friendship.
In other news tonight, demoralised and angry, now the junior doctors are to strike for 3 days in March. In the running after a bruising early battle, the three candidates to lead the SNP. And how do you make it again? Kefili, the cheese, returning to the place of its birth.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. All the horrors of war suffered by Ukraine, the slaughter, the atrocities, the bombings and the terrible hardship came flooding back on today's first anniversary of Russia's invasion. Also uppermost in people's minds, though, was something else, the extraordinary courage of a nation that has refused to capitulate to Moscow's military juggernaut. It is, of course, a war that tonight remains far from over. We'll hear from the front line shortly. But with the grief, the anger and the trauma commemorated by today's events, the determination of Ukraine's remarkable leader came through loud and clear. President Zelensky vowed his country will do everything to gain victory. Every tomorrow is worth fighting for, he said.
The men and women to whom Ukraine owes its existence. Regiments of the armed forces presented with new standards, battle honours from Mariupol, Kherson, Bakhmut, dozens of engagements that first stopped the Russian advance and then began to drive it back. Without these regiments, Ukraine would by now be a vassal state of Moscow. Honours and gallantry medals for the living. But too many, far too many of these awards for heroism could only be given to families left behind. For the tens of thousands of fallen, President Zelensky led the country in a minute's silence. He spoke to the nation in a televised address, as he does every day, remembering his first dramatic appearance at 7 a.m. on the morning of the invasion, reassuring his people he was going nowhere. He's been good to his word.
It's been a year of endurance, a year of compassion, a year of courage, a year of pain, a year of hope, a year of unity, a year of invincibility.
It's not hard to imagine what would have been happening in central Kyiv today had victorious Russians now been in control of this city. These were the scenes in the skies above Kyiv that morning. A lightning strike by Russian special forces against a major airport in the suburbs of the city. And these the triumphant videos released by the Russians of the blitzkrieg victory they thought they were winning.
Of course, nobody knew it at the time, but it was right here in Hostomel on that first day of the war that the fate of Kiev and thus perhaps of Ukraine was decided. secure this airbase to bring in supplies of troops, armour, helicopters, and the Russians could have launched a thrust directly into the heart of Kiev. When they failed to secure it, capturing the capital became nigh on impossible.
The graveyard of Russian armour and vehicles at Hostomel testifies to that failure. One victory saved the capital, but modern mechanised warfare, especially the pitiless Russian way of war, left behind thousands of murdered civilians, drove 8 million to flee from their country, reduced towns in the path of tanks and artillery to shattered concrete skeletons. Towns can one day be rebuilt, not the lives of widows like Yaroslava, who lived peacefully with her husband Vova in Borodyanka. This time last year, neither had any argument with Russia.
People say that your husband is your other half. He wasn't my half. He was my entirety. God had given me such a person, but I couldn't save him.
A family's grief multiplied tens of thousands of times across this country. A tsunami of tears driven by the imperial ambitions of one man. President Zelensky promised tonight there would be victory, that the sacrifice of these wounded soldiers he honoured today would not have been in vain. But when that would be, when his country's pain would end, he couldn't say. James Mates, News at 10, Kiev.
Well, indeed, fierce fighting with huge loss of life continues along the war's front line in the south and east of Ukraine. But this is a very different war from the one envisaged by President Putin when his troops rolled across the border a year ago. By the end of last March, Russian forces had made big advances in the south and the east, while in the north they were just 25 kilometres from the centre of Kyiv. But in the months that followed, Ukraine pushed back, regaining significant areas of territory, first around Kyiv, then around Kharkiv, and finally in the south, retaking Kherson. Well, Emma is in Kharkiv tonight. And Emma, we've seen many stands of solidarity from around the world today. How is that actually communicated to the fighters? Do they understand it on the front line? And if they do hear about it, what does it mean to them?
Well, we've spent much of the last week on the front line with those soldiers that you speak of, and without question there is a great belief in what they're doing, and there is also a real sense of pride and also gratitude for the solidarity that they see coming from around the world. But over and above all of that, there is one thing that they say over and over again, and that is, thank you for your support, we're grateful for it, but we need more. We need more ammunition, we need more weaponry, we need fighter jets, we need much more than you're willing to give at the moment. And without that, we cannot win this war. And they are very clear in that, and they are very clear in that because they see every single day on the battlefield the reality of it. They won't get into figures here about how many people have been killed or injured, but without question there have been terrible bloodbaths in this region. And you can probably hear behind me now the sirens are going off again. We're in Kharkiv. It's a standard city in this country, but you know, look behind me, it's in darkness. People live in fear all the time about what is going to go on. When these sirens go off at night, they don't run to the shelters anymore, they stay in their homes. But they know that they're under threat all the time. They know that at some point something truly dreadful could happen, and that without the help of the West, without the help of other people, they really do have a very big battle to win this fight. They have hope, but they have fear about how long it's going to go on.
Well, Emma, we're thinking of all those in Kharkiv, that they'll be safe tonight, and indeed you and your team also. Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, here in the UK, King Charles was among those who paid tribute to what he called the remarkable courage and resilience of Ukraine's people. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak led a nationwide minute's silence to mark Ukraine's resistance to Putin's war. He was joined outside Number 10 by Kyiv's ambassador to Britain and some of the Ukrainian troops being trained here. Across the country, a moment of reflection was observed on the streets and in community centres, many Ukrainians among those paying respect to those back home defending their country from Russia. And over 200,000 people, many with children, arrived from Ukraine on government visas to be placed with host families on the Homes for Ukraine scheme. The government says it's providing more funding to extend support for Ukrainian refugees as the war drags on. But more than 4,000 Ukrainian families are said to be facing homelessness.
New friends and a new home in Cheshire. These Ukrainians have escaped the war and are now trying to rebuild their lives here in Warrington. Most of them came to the UK on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, staying with a host. But a year on, those arrangements are rapidly coming to an end.
I don't think the policy was fully thought through, and they didn't think through what happens after 6 months. You know, if I wanted to end hosting, in order for my families to get more support, I would have to present them as homeless. Now, that's just the way that it's working. That's the policy. It's a crazy policy.
The abbreviation of which words?
For Ola, finding anywhere to rent has been an ongoing nightmare. When we first met 6 months ago, she was exhausted and tearful.
If you have no accommodation or a flat or a house, so we just have to think over our living in Ukraine.
Now she's working as a teaching assistant and has found a new home, but still constantly worries about money.
Everything is very different in Great Britain, and it's very hard to rent a house, mostly because of the salaries and the prices are very high.
Those here are on 3-year visas, as the fierce fighting at home shows no sign of ending. Some Ukrainians now have the stark choice of returning to a war-torn country or face destitution here. Figures show that more than 4,000 Ukrainian households presented themselves to councils as homeless, and the true figure could be much higher because not all local authorities report these numbers. Anfisa escaped to Britain from Kharkiv as it was being shelled last year. But when her arrangement with her host family in Oxfordshire ended, she found herself homeless and sleeping in this tent with her dogs here in Bracknell.
In winter, it's extremely cold. It's like a circle, you know, and I can't find the way out from that circle.
Anfisa has now turned to the council for help. Her search for somewhere to rent that's suitable for her and her beloved pets has hit a dead end. And for another night, she'll be sleeping rough.
Horrible, completely helpless, broken from inside, and I don't really understand what else I can do, because I keep struggling, I keep asking, I keep working hard to find accommodation by my own. It's like a nightmare for me.
The government says it is giving councils extra resources to deal with these issues, and hosts are getting increased thank you payments. Back in Cheshire, this is a time to remember those who have been lost, those still trapped, and others facing impossible choices. For many here, this is an incredibly emotional time. Sarah Corker, News at 10.
Now, a ceasefire plan for Ukraine that China came up with today may itself be unlikely to lead to peace, but President Zelensky said he's glad that China is at least talking about Ukraine, and Moscow will no doubt be listening too, because with sanctions biting, Russia is increasingly turning to Beijing to support its economy. The frontier between Russia and China is one of the longest land borders in the world. It also used to be one of the most hostile. That's changed now. The bridge over the remote Amur River at Hiei opened in June last year, a symbol of strengthening relations between the two countries.
It is in the frozen far north of China, where trade with Russia is hitting record levels. There were just a few dozen trucks crossing the Heilongjiang Bridge this morning. But since it opened last summer, the first highway connecting the two countries has been hailed a symbol of their growing cooperation and commitment. This is where the Power of Siberia pipeline also enters the country and is now supplying the Chinese market with gas once destined for Europe. Since the start of the war, Beijing has been buying up as much energy as it can from its sanctioned neighbour. For small businesses in this border town, it's good to have friends like Russia.
We align with Russia to hamper the actions of the EU and America. China won't succeed on its own.
In a meeting with China's top diplomat on Wednesday, President Putin declared relations are reaching new heights. It is feared those heights could involve a deal for drones. The German magazine Der Spiegel claims this Chinese firm is in negotiations to supply Russia with 100 kamikaze drones for delivery in April. It backs up US intelligence that China is preparing to supply lethal aid. To head off those mounting accusations, the Chinese government today presented a 12-point plan for political settlement in Ukraine. The Foreign Ministry spokesman said it was proof China won't send arms to Moscow.
We don't sell arms to any regions in conflicts or to warring parties. In short, what China has done is to promote peace talks.
The elderly crowd gathered to dance on the banks of the Russian border this afternoon will remember a time when the two countries didn't see eye to eye. The Cold War allies were once split over relations with the West. Now it is a shared worldview that perhaps more than trade deals and pipelines is banding them together.
It wasn't so long ago that this border was a point of conflict between China and Russia. Relations between the two neighbours haven't always been as apparently rock solid as they are today. But Moscow's pivot to the east has given Beijing the upper hand in their limitless friendship, and the Communist Party will use that to further its own interests.
China has managed to prop up its own economy, and without violating international sanctions, its trade has allowed a steady flow of cash to continue into Moscow's war chest. For all the talk of peace, we have yet to see anything from President Xi that indicates he is willing to intervene. Debbie Edward, News at 10 on the China-Russia border.
Well, let's return now to James in Kyiv after a day of sombre reflection and ongoing defiance in Ukraine, James, but also significant messages emanating from around the world. China with its 12-point plan, the US and Europe talking about reinforcing Ukraine's fight. What's your take at the end of this significant day?
Yeah, I mean, I do think today is significant because it does seem to have focused minds on the fact that we can't just let this war drift on for year after year. What we are seeing is sort of an acceleration of activity. We had the G7 meeting today run by President Biden, Rishi Sunak and President Zelensky were all in on the video call, saying it was stepping up action against Russia and most significantly was going to put the squeeze on any country that is helping Russia to avoid sanctions. Those Leopard 2 German-built tanks that Poland promised, well, they weren't meant to be here next month. Until next month, we gather that the first ones have arrived today. That could open the floodgates. The Swedes, not even members of NATO, say they're going to send tanks now. Denmark saying, look, we must think about sending aircraft. We have lots of F-16s that we might want to send. The Poles saying they will join Britain in training Ukrainians to fly F-16s. And while all this is going on, President Zelensky said today that he wants to hold a summit with President Xi of China to try and focus Chinese minds on the fact that their interests may well be served better by protecting their interests with the West rather than all those interests with Russia that Debbie was talking about there. So it's important on this anniversary that a feeling that we're not all going to be here on February the 24th next year reporting the same tragedy.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed for that. In other news tonight now, England's beleaguered health service is facing yet more disruption. Junior doctors have announced they are to go on strike for 3 consecutive days in the middle of next month in their dispute over pay. Martin's with me now to talk this through. I mean, this is another part of the health service disrupted. Many people will be very worried hearing this news. Just take us through it.
Well, the first thing to note is that junior doctors make up about 40% of the medical workforce. It's everything from those who have just left medical school all the way up until you were to become a consultant. So a huge body of people. And the British Medical Association says it's got unprecedented precedent to carry out this strike. They say that in the ballot, nearly 37,000 junior doctors voted. Of those, 98% voted in favour of strike action. So what it means is there'll be a 72-hour walkout in England starting on Monday the 13th of March, running day and night all the way until 7 a.m. on Thursday the 16th of March. So a really big bulk. It includes routine as well as emergency care. And if we take a bit of context, the last time there was a junior doctor strike, 300,000 outpatient appointments, including operations, were cancelled, and this strike will last longer. The union says it has to do it because in real terms, after inflation, it says they've had a 26% pay cut over the last 15 years. The government may dispute that. They say they're putting record funding in. They say their pay deal is fair, and they're very disappointed that it's come down to this.
OK, Martin, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. If there was one sliver of hope after the shooting of an off-duty police officer in front of his son in Northern Ireland, it was that all 5 of Stormont's political parties came together today to condemn the outrage and call for unity. Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell remains critically ill and heavily sedated in hospital. Police, who arrested a 5th person tonight, are blaming dissident Republican terrorists.
For months, they've been unable to sit round a table and form a government in Northern Ireland. But leaders from its 5 main parties were united in outrage today. A symbolic stand against the terrorists now suspected of carrying out this week's shooting.
It is so important in moments like this that we stand united, and we do stand here united as one voice in our condemnation against this horrific attack on a police officer, someone who's part of our community.
The murder of police officers and the attempted killing was unacceptable when my cousin was the first RUC officer to be murdered by the IRA in 1970. It was never acceptable, and it is not acceptable now. It will not be tolerated.
DCI John Caldwell was shot up to 4 times by 2 masked men in front of his teenage son and other children on Wednesday night. His chief constable said this show of solidarity is important to his family.
John remains in hospital where he is critically ill and heavily sedated. Last night I had the chance to speak to John's wife and his son. They are clearly heavily affected by what they've gone through, but want to pass on their thanks both to the people that rendered first aid and care at the scene, but also in terms of the outpouring of support from across the community.
Police arrested a 5th man tonight and believe a group called the New IRA was behind the attack outside this sports centre where John Caldwell had been coaching football while off duty. His attackers knew when and where the well-known officer would be. Does there need to be a rethink about how identifiable police officers are in Northern Ireland?
I think that's one of the outcomes that the terrorists want. What they want is police to withdraw from communities, to withdraw from society. We need a face. Policing needs a face, and they need people to appear, to talk to the public.
Despite their inability to form an executive, the political parties say they will at least work together to counter the sort of violence seen this week. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Belfast.
The 3 candidates to be the next leader of the SNP and Scotland's First Minister were confirmed today in what is already becoming something of a bruising affair. And as Kate Forbes, Humza Yousaf and Ash Regan start their campaigns, there is little sign of the divisions being bridged anytime soon.
With nominations secured, it's all smiles at Ash Regan's launch. She's best known as an SNP rebel who stepped down from her ministerial role having disagreed with Nicola Sturgeon. Her campaign is focused on the route to independence with a so-called voter empowerment mechanism, which sounds very similar to Sturgeon's de facto referendum plan.
The first election that we get over 50% plus 1, we will see that as a clear instruction from the people of Scotland that they want us to commence negotiations.
That's the same as a de facto referendum if you got 50 plus 1 at the next general election.
But then if we don't, we can do it at the next election. So
it's just de facto referendum again and again and again until you get 50 plus 1?
No, it's not.
What's different?
The fact that it is giving the power back to the people of Scotland, and that we will also work with all the other independence parties as well.
And is 50 plus 1 enough for you?
I hope it'll be higher. I really do. I think.
What do you hope for?
I'm not going to put a figure on that.
And it's not just the path to independence that the party is divided over. Hamza Yusuf is the only candidate who wants to challenge the UK government over the blocking of the gender reform bill.
It's a point of principle. Whether you agree with GRR or disagree with GRR, the point is this. This is the first time the UK government have taken the red pen to a piece of legislation that's been passed by the majority of the Scottish Parliament.
No word from Kate Forbes today, who, despite her controversial social views, came out top in a survey of SNP voters. One of the country's leading political experts says supporters may be focusing their attention on other issues.
The question you have to ask yourself is, to what extent do these cultural issues matter to SNP voters as compared to other issues such as the state of Scotland's public services, the state of Scotland's economy, and above all, how independence is to be pursued.
But the next leader is in the hands of SNP members, who must decide by the end of March which path they want their party to take. Louise Scott, News at 10.
The death was announced today of Sir Bernard Ingham, Margaret Thatcher's famous chief press secretary throughout most of her time at Number 10. Until he came along, the art of political spin used to be the job of anonymous Whitehall mandarins. An imposing Yorkshireman, Bernard Ingham was by contrast bluff, outspoken and sometimes scathing, and a formidable advocate of Mrs Thatcher's brand of conservatism. Sir Bernard has died at the age of 90. Now, if you're partial to a spot of cheese, Gromit, you might be fond of a piece of crumbly Caerphilly from time to time. What you might not know, though, is that this most famous of all Welsh cheeses, the only cheese to originate in Wales, in fact, hasn't been made in the place that bears its name for nearly 30 years. Now, that could be about to change.
Famous for its castle and its cheese, Caerphilly has a proud history.
Yeah, go for it.
But local production of the world-famous crumbly white cheese ended in the 90s. Now, thanks to two local lads, the Caerphilly is coming home.
Well, we're basically in the shadow of the castle making the cheese, so you can't really get much closer. So the story just comes together, really. We're looking, it's all local milk and Caerphilly cheese made in Caerphilly.
Popular with local miners for not drying out underground, the Caerphilly is one of Wales's most successful culinary exports. Diane and Hugh are eager to restore a proud tradition.
We've used a traditional recipe with a few little tweaks, and we're quite happy with the way it's going.
Yeah, we're definitely not quite market ready, but give us another couple of weeks or a couple of months and we will be ready, and we look forward for everybody to try it.
And this is the current finished product. Let's have a go. I mean, I think that's lovely, but I'm not from Caerphilly, so let's see if this passes the taste test of the local connoisseur. So yeah, since the 90s, it's only been made in England, in right. Somerset and Wiltshire. What are your first thoughts?
I know Caerphilly cheese well. It's nice, it's smooth, yeah.
Very creamy. Really nice. Yeah, nice and crumbly.
What better way to enjoy Caerphilly cheese by Caerphilly Castle?
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah. It's tasty. It's tasty.
Well, the early reviews are encouraging. Aptly, the aim is for the first Caerphilly cheese produced in the town this century to go on sale at the town's very own food festival in April. Rhys Williams, News at 10, Caerphilly.
Wonderful. Now, before we go, let's return to our main news tonight. People in Ukraine and in many other places have spent today commemorating the first anniversary of the dark day that Vladimir Putin launched his invasion. It's a war with all its human cost and horrifying implications that rages on. But in the fire of battle, it has forged heroic unity within Ukraine and ever-growing support in the UK, across Europe and the wider West. We leave you tonight with some of the sights and sounds which have defined the past year in Ukraine's brave fight for freedom. Good night.
We know freedom will win. We know Russia will lose.
The so-called irresistible force of Putin's war machine has broken on the immovable object of Ukrainian patriotism. This is Ukraine's finest hour.